Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Summer 2007. The temperature was 48 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there was no shade. Private Dean Connolly of the Royal Anglian Regiment had been in country for 11 weeks. He had lost 4 men from his platoon. He had not slept longer than 3 consecutive hours in 9 days. And on this particular morning, crouching behind a mud wall with rounds cracking overhead and the smell of burning diesel filling his lungs, he was trying to remember what silence felt like. He could not. Most people who talk about Afghanistan talk about 2 things: the politics and the casualties, the debates about whether it was worth it, the arguments about strategy and nation building and whether Western forces should have been there at all. Those conversations matter, but they have almost nothing to do with what the men and women who actually served there experienced on the ground day after day in one of the most punishing environments on the planet. This is about what they actually went through, not the headlines, not the politicians, the soldiers. And once you understand what British forces encountered in Helmand between 2006 and 2014, you will wonder how they managed to function at all. Let us start with the heat. Because it sounds like a complaint until you understand what extreme heat does to a human body wearing full combat equipment. A British soldier on patrol in Helmand carried between 40 and 60 pounds of kit: body armour, helmet, weapon, ammunition, water, radio batteries, medical supplies, all of it worn in temperatures that regularly exceeded 50 degrees in high summer. The body begins to fail in that heat with that kind of load. Muscles cramp without warning. Vision blurs. Concentration collapses in ways you cannot feel happening, which makes it more dangerous, not less. You make decisions with a brain that is slowly cooking inside your skull, and those decisions determine whether you or the man beside you lives or dies. The Army issued guidance on water intake. Soldiers were told to drink litres per hour. In practice, water resupply in remote patrol bases was unreliable. Men went without. Dehydration became so routine that soldiers stopped recognizing it in themselves. They described feeling drunk without the pleasure of alcohol, slow, confused, irritable, on patrol, in contact with the enemy, with everything depending on sharp thinking. That was just the heat. Then there was the ground itself. Helmand Province sits in a river valley surrounded by desert, and the terrain does something that no training exercise in Britain fully replicates. It exhausts you psychologically before it exhausts you physically. Irrigation ditches ran in every direction, some of them invisible beneath cultivated crops until you were already falling in. Fields of tall maize and cannabis plants, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters, blocked sight lines entirely. A patrol could move through that ground for hours without seeing more than 10 meters in any direction. The Taliban knew this. They had grown up in it. They used it the way British soldiers in an earlier century had used the hedgerows of Normandy. Every ditch was a potential firing point. Every tree line was a potential ambush. Every compound had 3 walls you could see and 1 you could not reach in time. Veterans described the particular dread of that landscape in almost identical terms. The waiting, not knowing, the way the ground forced you to bunch together because the alternative was losing sight of the man ahead. And the Taliban had learned that when British soldiers bunched, they became a single target. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs. The word sounds clinical. The reality was not clinical at all. In 2009 and 2010, at the height of British operations in Helmand, the Taliban planted devices in roads, in culverts, in doorways, in the walls of compounds, in the carcasses of dead animals under tiles inside pots beneath the disturbed earth of a path that 100 men had walked safely before today. Bomb disposal operators, the men of the Royal Engineers and later the Joint Force EOD teams, were working 12 to 18-hour days in that heat, clearing routes, responding to contacts, digging devices out of the earth with hands that were steady because they had trained them to be steady even when the rest of the body wanted to run. The statistics tell part of the story. By 2010, IEDs accounted for over half of all British casualties in Afghanistan. But statistics do not tell you what it looked like to the section behind when the man at the front stepped on a pressure plate. They do not tell you what it does to the soldiers who survive, who continue the patrol, who have to be on that same road again tomorrow. There is a phenomenon that military psychologists documented extensively during the Helmand campaign, but which received almost no coverage in the general press. It was called hypervigilance, though that phrase makes it sound manageable, almost reasonable. It was not manageable. Soldiers returning from tours where IED threat was constant described being physically unable to walk on pavements in Britain. They walked in the road instead. They avoided bridges. They scanned gutters and parked cars with eyes that could not stop working because for months their lives had depended on never stopping. One veteran from the Rifles described sitting at a family dinner in Worcestershire 6 weeks after returning home, watching his hands shake whilst holding a knife and fork, unable to explain to his mother why he needed to sit with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. That was the legacy of Helmand for thousands of men and women, not the dramatic breakdowns of fiction, the quiet, grinding, relentless damage. The nature of the fighting itself was unlike anything British forces had encountered since the Korean War. Helmand was not the short, sharp combat of the Falklands. It was not the mechanised manoeuvre of the Gulf in 1991. It was months of patrol, contact, withdrawal, patrol, contact again. The same ground contested endlessly. Patrol bases that sat in territory the Taliban regarded as their own, surrounded on 3 sides, sometimes 4. Resupply convoys that were attacked on every other run. Casualty evacuation helicopters that sometimes could not reach a wounded man for 30 minutes, because there were not enough aircraft and there was never enough aircraft. In 2006, when 3 para deployed to Helmand as part of the initial British commitment, the commanders expected a stabilisation mission. The brigadier in charge described it publicly as a task that might be completed without firing a shot. Within weeks, British forces were engaged in some of the most intense infantry fighting since Korea. The Taliban had no intention of being stabilised. They fought for every district centre, every town, every road junction, and British forces, massively outnumbered in certain engagements, held their positions and held them again and held them again. The Battle of Nowzad, the Siege of Musa Sala, the fighting around Sangin, which by the end of the campaign had claimed more British lives than any other single location in Afghanistan. These were not minor engagements. They were sustained, grinding, attritional battles fought by small numbers of British soldiers against forces that could absorb casualties and keep attacking in ways that NATO doctrine had not planned for. At Nowzad in 2006, a company of parachute regiment soldiers held a district centre against wave after wave of Taliban attacks for weeks. They were outnumbered. They were undersupplied. Air support was sporadic. Artillery support was limited by concerns about civilian casualties. The men who held that building did so with rifles and machine guns and the particular British infantry quality that their opponents underestimated every single time. They did not break. They did not withdraw. They held because holding was what they had been sent there to do. But holding took something from them that no official report fully quantified. Sleep deprivation in Helmand was structural, not incidental. Patrol bases were small enough that the perimeter required constant manning. A soldier on a 6-month tour might complete a week of night patrols, then rotate to days, then be tasked for an operation that ran through both. The Army publishes research on what sleep deprivation does to cognitive function, to emotional regulation, to the body's ability to heal. In a patrol base in Helmand, that research was largely irrelevant. There was not enough manpower to give everyone 8 hours. There was barely enough to give everyone 4. Men described making complex tactical decisions, writing contact, reports, treating casualties, on sleep cycles that would have been considered dangerous in a hospital setting, and they did not talk about it. This is perhaps the most distinctively British element of the entire experience. The culture of the British Army, particularly the infantry, runs on understatement so deep that it becomes a kind of self-censorship. You do not complain. You do not describe what the last 6 months actually felt like, because the man beside you went through the same thing, and he is not describing it either. Talking about fear or exhaustion or the psychological weight of having watched a friend die, and then continued the patrol, that is not what you do. You make tea, you make dark jokes, you carry on. This cultural characteristic, admirable in many ways, created a generation of veterans who returned to Britain with wounds that were invisible and largely unspoken. The Army's mental health infrastructure in the mid-2000s was not ready for the scale of what Helmand produced. Combat Stress, the veterans' mental health charity, reported a 53% increase in referrals between 2006 and 2011. The waiting list stretched to months. Men who had held compound walls in 48-degree heat against Taliban fighters were waiting in queue to speak to someone about what that had actually been like. many did not wait. Many did not seek help at all. The transition from Helmand back to Britain was its own particular violence, not physical, but no less damaging. A soldier could be in a firefight in Sangin on a Tuesday and standing in a supermarket in Colchester on a Saturday. There was no decompression, not really. A few days in Cyprus on the way home, some group sessions, a briefing on the signs of PTSD, then back to normal life, which was not normal and would not feel normal for a very long time. Veterans described the bewilderment of civilian life after Helmand. Not anger, not in most cases, just a profound inability to locate themselves in a world where the consequences of inattention were trivial, where the worst thing that happened at work was a missed deadline, where nobody needed to check a vehicle for hidden devices before opening the door. The skills that Helmand had built, the hypervigilance, the reading of threat, the immediate assessment of every space for angles and cover, those skills did not switch off because the tour was over. They ran continuously, without purpose, consuming energy and creating anxiety that had nowhere to go. One veteran described it as being permanently tuned to a frequency that no longer broadcast anything. The receiver still working perfectly, just nothing coming through. There is one aspect of the Afghanistan experience that British soldiers discuss almost exclusively amongst themselves, rarely in public and almost never in the media: the moral weight of the rules of engagement. This is not a criticism of those rules. The rules exist for legitimate and important reasons, but the practical effect, in a counterinsurgency where the enemy deliberately operated among civilians, where a compound might shelter a family and a firing position simultaneously, was that soldiers made impossible decisions under fire and then lived with those decisions for the rest of their lives. A soldier who held fire because he was uncertain whether the man in the tree line was armed. A section commander who called in fire support and then found out what had been in the building. These were not failures of character or training. They were the inevitable consequences of a war fought in populated areas against an enemy that understood and exploited the constraints placed on British forces. But the weight of those moments, the replaying of them, the searching for the decision that might have changed the outcome, that is something no operational debrief adequately addresses. Britain committed over 150,000 personnel to Afghanistan over 13 years. 454 of them did not come home. Thousands more were physically wounded, many catastrophically. The number with lasting psychological injury is harder to count because many never appeared in any statistic. They left the army quietly. They struggled quietly. Some found their way through, some did not. The political debate about what was achieved in Afghanistan will continue for decades. Whether the mission was strategically coherent, whether the sacrifice was proportionate to the outcome, whether the Taliban's eventual return to power rendered the entire enterprise futile. Those arguments will fill books and parliamentary inquiries and history syllabuses for a generation. But beneath that debate, mostly unheard, is something else. The account of what it was actually like. The heat and the ground and the waiting. The weight of the equipment and the weight of the decisions. The patrols through crop lines where you could not see, and the roads where the earth itself might kill you. The patrol bases held by small numbers of men against forces that did not stop coming. The return home that felt like arriving in a foreign country. The silence about all of it, because silence was what the culture demanded, and silence was what most of them gave. Private Dean Connolly finished his tour. He came home in October 2007. He left the army in 2009. He now works as a builder in Lincolnshire. He does not talk about Helmand much, not to people who were not there. There are things, he has said, that you can only explain to someone who already knows. Everything else is just words that do not quite fit around the shape of what happened. He is not unusual. He is, in almost every respect, entirely typical. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what British soldiers experienced in Afghanistan. Not the exceptional acts of courage, though there were many, officially recognised and otherwise. Not the headline moments of the campaign, but the ordinary, grinding, invisible experience of tens of thousands of men and women who went to one of the hardest places on earth, did what they were asked to do, came home, and got on with it. Largely without recognition, almost entirely without public understanding of what that getting on with it actually cost. They deserved better than that, they still do. If this is the kind of history you think more people should hear, the stories that do not make the front pages, the experiences that get buried beneath politics and headlines, then consider subscribing. Every video on this channel exists to tell those stories properly, with the detail and the respect they deserve. If this one meant something to you, share it, because the best way to make sure these accounts are not forgotten is to make sure more people find them. And if there is a story you think belongs here, leave it in the comments below. We read every single one.